Welcome everybody to our launch of our joint European Chamber and MERICS report, China's Innovation Ecosystem, Right for Many but Not for All. My name is Esther Cañada, and I am filling in for our Policy and Communications Coordinator and Press Officer, Charlotte. So a couple of points before we start. For all participants, this session is going to be on the record and recorded. Also, please note that you are more than welcome to send questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. However, please take into account that since this is a media session as well as a member launch, we are going to prioritize questions from our media friends. Also, for media representatives, kind reminder to quote our President York in his European Chamber capacity. And of course, MERICS colleagues will be quoted in their MERICS capacity. All right, without further ado, York, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to do this with MERICS again. We had a great decoupling story coming out last January. And in the meantime, we lost Jacob Gunther, but he ended up in a better port. He's now basically working for MERICS. So he crossed borders and we kept him on the salary payroll, so to speak, by having him as a lead pen on their side. So it's in-house, as you can see, wonderful cooperation. And we do it like this. Miko is going to guide you through the slides. After every slide, I will sort of chip in a couple of words on how I see this as well. And at the end, then, of course, we have recommendations and then we open up for the questions. So without much ado, I think, Miko, you start.
Thanks, Jürgen. For the introduction of the baseline and background, I'll hand over to Jacob immediately and then get back to the substance in a second. Jacob, over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Jürgen. Miko. So really quickly, just as kind of background and methodology for how this report was put together. Throughout the winter of 2021 and 2022, we surveyed 32 different members of the European Chamber. That were kind of drawn from the R&D working group as well as the advisory council. And the reason that we didn't send off the survey to the entire membership was basically that we wanted a really in-depth survey to get kind of the deep expertise that we could draw from the R&D working group rather than from the kind of general points of contact like chief representatives, GMs and such. So the survey response rate, despite being, a relatively small sample size, is incredibly deep and, a very highly motivated group to be able to take this on. The most represented industries were the chemicals, automotive, and machinery industries, which, as we'll get into later, kind of indicates a certain level of optimism within some of the findings. And then with the interviews, we spoke with 11 different member companies of the European Chamber, again, across a pretty wide range of industries. All but one were big multinationals, with one SME interviewed. However, we were able to get a lot of useful information about how SMEs view the R&D and innovation ecosystem in China, because as all these MNCs have a lot of SME suppliers, we were able to get useful information from the big multinational OEMs. And a last important note is that all the survey responses and interviews were done prior to the big Omicron wave that hit China, most notably in Shanghai, but also throughout other cities in the country. And all but a couple of the interviews were done prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think Jürg and others at the Chamber will add a little bit of nuance to the findings based off of their flash survey that they published at the start of May to kind of add in a little bit of that element. And with that, I will pass it over to Miko.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Jörg. And it is our absolute pleasure to be collaborating again with the UCCC on a topic that we think is at the forefront of not only corporate, but also political realities in many ways that we'll touch upon later. I want to thank the team at EUCCC for the collaboration, but also obviously on our side, Jacob, Jeroen, and others who've worked on the report. I also want to make sure that it's well known. This is a project funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research, and we have partners, including 2 German universities, University of Duisburg, Essen, and Bochum, that we collaborate with in doing this first exercise here, which is hopefully part of a longer stream of research efforts and further surveys that we hope to conduct in the future. So this is, if you wish, a set of initial results of a longer term effort looking at those trends that we see, and innovation in and with China is probably the most important overarching frame here that we look at. So to get us started, in terms of the kind of R&D being done in China, trends are overwhelmingly moving away from just localizing products developed outside of China and more towards developing new goods and services in China for global offerings. And in the time frame, we have looked at the respondents expect to be doing more R&D in China for global offerings and to treat China as one component in a global portfolio of complementary R&D centers. So respondents universally found that their China R&D is either moderately or deeply integrated with their global innovation strategies. This clearly reflects the growing scope of R&D operations, but also of the increasing competitiveness of China's innovation ecosystem in delivering results that are valuable to global operations. Interviews also noted that China is an increasingly valuable partner of a 24-hour R&D timeline, in which researchers, engineers in Europe, North America, and China can hand off work to one another for continuous innovation. Over to you, Jörg, for your comment. You're still muted.
See, they want to censor me. The sample that we have is small, but very important. It reflects a major chunk of European business. Again, it's automotive, it is chemicals, and it's machinery. It is very telling why actually we do more integration, because these are the successful 3 areas where we are getting engaged. As I think Jacob will maybe later show you that on the ICT side, we just had 1 respondent, and it was the most pessimistic. So auto, chemicals, machinery are earning money, and the money earned over here, of course, they can spend on research and primarily on development. So the demand story is also driving us here in our research and development area. And then, of course, there's the simple brain power. China produces or graduates every year 4 million students in so-called STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That is as much as the US, UK, Japan, Germany, and Korea graduate together. So you have an incredible pool that you can basically draw from. And I just looked at the HSBC list in order to see the how China fares in the global share among the top 100 ranked universities, and telling again, it fits perfectly our sample that in engineering, China is pretty much out of 24 universities, 12 #1 globally, primarily in instruments and chemical engineering, as well as automation and so forth. And it's also interesting to see that in other areas, such as life sciences, biology, human biology science, China is 1 or nothing when it comes to international top ranked 100. Same in medical sciences, where technology is 1 out of 100. And so natural sciences, for example, geography, ecology, 1% or 5 out of 100. So in a way, the companies that we ask actually are here because the demand is fitting, and as well at the same time, they have the right brain power, because exactly in their area, that's where China produces the best students and the best workers globally. So what's next is what we're going to do with this. Mikko.
Jacob, you can move on the slide.
Thanks.
Just in terms of the hard figures that we're looking at here, and again, small sample initial survey, R&D intensity, so the R&D spending as a percentage of revenue for most respondents was generally at or somewhat behind industry norm globally. But R&D spending has been and is expected to continue to rise in China, with roughly 75% increasing spending between 2020 and 2021, and further increases to be expected, roughly the same amount of respondents. So the trend indicates a clear growing desire for optimistic European companies to close the spending gap of their China R&D with their global norm for R&D spending. How does that play out on the ground, Jörg?
Three areas. It's again these three areas where our companies are active, and they feel comfortable primarily when it comes to the IPR situation. Again, 38% is not bad. It used to be much lower. But again, we talk about multinationals, and that's where basically the title from our study comes from. China is right for many, but not for all, because for multinationals, actually, the kind of spending the money, the turnover they generate, and the protection they can build around it with good lawyers, with good schemes in order to address IPR law courts, is already in itself very telling. And then, of course, overwhelming majority is increasing R&D, because those companies believe they can outpace the Chinese competitor, that they can outrun the fact that Chinese competitors are getting faster and faster. Some might actually steal or attempt to steal the technologies. And many of our members actually believe that once the competitor maybe has obtained this technology, they have already moved on one or two steps in order to actually address another field for business. So in a way, but again, you have to keep in mind that survey was done before COVID hit Shanghai in particular. And that actually might have been slightly different if we are going to increase our R&D spending, because China is viewed, as you could have seen in our survey from May 5th, slightly less positive because of the lockdown conditions. And again, overwhelming majority increases, but there's a lot of discussions going on data transfer laws and regulatory environment that might be pushing back on our attempts. So the willingness, given the market size, given how much money we can make in order to spend it on R&D, the pushback might come from the regulatory environment, overemphasis on security, not really business friendly. And then, of course, the big unknown is sanctions. US sanctions, export limitations coming out of China. Is Europe going to have sanctions? And of course, that leads our companies to possibly have to go into deep study in order to see how secure they can do R&D in China in the future. Over to you, Nico.
Thanks, and we're already in the middle of the debate of key advantages and maybe downsides or challenges that companies face. And the weaknesses that you've already mentioned. But let's stay for a second maybe with the reasons why companies are seeking more R&D investments in China. Clearly, three factors stand out here: strong local demand, appetite for European innovative goods and services. So just to give you one example, an industrial equipment maker remarked that because China is its largest market for several products, they've almost fully localized production for those lines of business, both for the China market and for export. And as a result, much of the development and also application side of its innovation activities for those products is now done in China. Second big factor is the fast pace of commercial application of R&D results. Again, just one example, an interviewed head of technology scouting cited an example of attending a conference where they met a researcher that was demonstrating some promising findings for a piece of technology they were interested in developing, and they ended up forming a partnership with the individual, going from carrying out basic research to becoming a tier 1 supplier for their global offerings in the span of just only a few years. The startup culture is also something that is quite important for the speed of commercialization. Another example, an interviewee noted that the partnership with a startup that they have developed to work on a digital twin application to train customers and suppliers. They produced the application in a single month for 500,000 Chinese yuan, where if they had done it themselves or differently, it would have probably taken them half a year and cost 500,000 euros. So differences in terms of pace of commercial application. And then finally, the abundance of local collaboration partners. Local private companies were a partner for roughly 60% of respondents, and that includes China's digital champions and Alibaba, Tencent. And so one of the patterns that we can recognize is a marriage of European hardware with Chinese software. And the strength of local partners' connectivity services, specifically 5G, satellite communication, quantum technology, especially in computing, sensors, and communication, is increasing the importance for European companies' global portfolios to do more R&D in China. Back to you.
Well, this slide, I think, to me, has two myth busters in there. One is you assume that the government supports everything, subsidies left and right, deep pockets, but you can see that actually the innovation system, sufficient government support is viewed by 0% as important. And then you would expect a huge domestic market like China in order to have an incredible advantage when it comes to access to data set is just 5%. So in a way, what really makes a difference here, that is 68% in 3 cases, is demand and is size of market and is demand again. So that actually we can sell stuff, we can generate the income, we can use it for research, we grow with our customers. And also in many ways, actually, the kind of profit that we generate here goes back home to our headquarters and finances research and development there. So it's not just that we are spending money here. As a matter of fact, we're earning money here in order to do primarily, of course, development. The other one is, so it's demand. I think that's really driving the size, the pace of innovation system here. And then it's speed. The commercial applications are getting introduced very fast by Chinese customers. So in a way, our Chinese customers are driving us in order to be faster than we are in our home markets. Then, of course, it comes always with this kind of risk that you might actually come up with a product which does really work. But at the same time, you learn so much about this also for your global operations, just not to wait for until a product or a system is 110%, but try with your customers to do it. That's the characteristic of the Chinese market is if it doesn't work, they move on, and they move on really, really fast. Then abundance of local collaboration partners. Again, primarily it's our customers. Not only do they pay for it, they give us ideas, and they themselves in many cases have very, very sophisticated and demanding urban citizens as customers, putting pressure on them as well. Chinese customers are very choosy, less brand loyal. That drives, you have to come up with something really new and something which is different. And of course, that drives our development efforts. And then, of course, interesting to see abundance of local talent. Well, I said before, 4 million graduates every year at STM, EM, but at the same time, there is not as many people as we would like to have. And the trend line that we also see is that many students actually study abroad and stay abroad. They're not coming back. I give you one example from the artificial intelligence area. 56% of the Chinese students actually go to the US to study there. 34% are staying and studying artificial intelligence in China, and the other 10% somewhere else in the world. I hope it's Germany, of course. And then we have those 88% of the students that study artificial intelligence in the US don't come back, 88%. So you have only 10% come back. So in a way, you have 1/3 of all artificial intelligence talents in the world with Chinese background, but only 10% of them live in China. That in itself is interesting to see. So in a way, China develops this kind of brain power, and us in other OECD countries primarily, of course, we benefit from this tremendously. Now, AI might be an outlier in this sense, but I can also already now see that talents, engineering talents in particular, possibly given lockdowns and everything, are really considering, shall I stay or shall I go? Yeah. Miko?
Thanks. Moving on to challenges and those factors that hold back the full potential of European R&D in China. Again, it's a pretty mixed picture here, and I want to focus on a few points, and we'll get to the question of the role of government support and the support schemes again in a minute. But first, traditional issue, weak IPR protection systems, mind you, and well noted in all the interviews and well established, I think, by the work of the EU CCC business confidence surveys. The IPR system has steadily improved according to surveys done by the EU CCC. But issues related, for instance, to trade secret protection, enforcement, or for instance, non-compete clauses for engineers and researchers who often go to work for state-owned competitors and then take European know-how with them. Those issues remain extremely high on the list, despite the fact that, for instance, patent protections, etc., have become stronger and stronger. Unlevel playing field overall for foreign companies, another pretty significant factor here. A lot of interviews reported that they struggle to obtain HNTE, so a high and new technology enterprise status, which helps you to get your corporate tax rate down from 25% to 15% in some cases, and that's a challenge in many ways. Other companies report different experiences here, so mixed picture, but overall still a pretty significant unlevel playing field for foreign companies with regard to access to those preferred tax schemes. Finally, insufficient, and that's somewhat contradictory to what we've discussed, some report insufficient local talent. So the challenge of actually, often companies feeling that they're training engineers for their competitors. And Jörg will know more about the challenges of actually holding talent inside companies. Back to you, Jörg.
Well, two things we don't have to worry about. 0% is not enough market competition and not enough demand. That's the last thing we have to worry about. Again, weak IPR protection systems is something where multinationals can deal with. Again, China is right for many, but not for all. It means it's tough for SMEs. And SMEs don't have this kind of legal background, this kind of wealth of information. And so we have, in essence, multinationals much more optimistic and stronger engaged than SMEs are not. And that's a great pity. Because SMEs, in particular my country, are the backbone of innovation, the Mittelstand, which is very important. And actually, they're also bloody important here for China. You have China SMEs are standing for 60% of GDP, 75% of for industrial production, 90% of exports, those products that actually are really globally competing and need development in order to be top-notch. And 75% of all patents in force in the industrial sector come from SMEs. Chinese SMEs, of course, primarily. But if we have the same problem like Chinese SMEs, we are possibly facing so many headwinds that many of our European SMEs don't feel comfortable coming out here and bringing the latest products and systems into the marketplace, basically depriving China on development opportunities. Again, the brain drain we discussed before, it's not just that they are not coming back from the US or Europe, but also that you are having a hard time in order to sign up people and then make sure that they stay with you. And if they don't stay with you, that they don't produce your product with someone else. But again, we have a very clear message from our members in our last flash survey. The major part of our membership said, given COVID, given the crisis, we are not laying off people. And that simply has to do with the fact that there has been so much investment in human resources that companies are willing to bite the bullet and go through a rougher period of time and not like many of their domestic competitors are laying off people, but hanging on. And then, of course, the last point from my side, that slide again was done pre-lockdown, pre-COVID challenges. Negative home market views on R&D in China, 23%. It could well be that this figure actually goes up because of what happened in Ukraine and the lockdown that caused so many problems, not only to the economy, but also to the allure, in particular of Shanghai, being such a wonderful place for research and development. And Shanghai will struggle in order to get back the kind of positive place that they always had in our R&D scheme. Mikko.
Thanks, Jörg. And 2 slides maybe to wrap this up on our side and then get into the recommendation section where We want to look a bit deeper at access to government support and the barriers that companies see with regard to obtaining equal access to innovation support schemes. Well-known story, but worth pulling out more here again. More than 50% of respondents report that they have pretty significant access to local government support compared to just 15% with regard to national support. So it's considerably easier for them to find support at the local level. Interviews noting that local governments often very proactively send along information about opportunities to foreign companies, largely as officials obviously are very keen to keep foreign investors happy and operating in their jurisdiction. What's quite interesting is that there's limited interest only in special high-tech and innovation zones. Most companies still obviously continue to prefer that their R&D centers are close to their operations and customers. But indeed, some SMEs report that they have benefited significantly when they moved and located to such a zone. And maybe just moving on, and then Jörg, you can bundle your points on those two slides. If you look at the barriers for European companies from obtaining equal access to innovation support schemes, Jacob, thank you, it's still, in a sense, the old factors: opaque or unclear application information and processes. As we mentioned earlier, HNTE status is quite significant there as a problem. Explicit rules that prevent foreign companies from accessing support. Interviews in the energy and chemical companies encountered those challenges in certain projects, especially at the national level. And then quite often support schemes are not publicly announced, but just communicated only to local companies. Again, a barrier for equal access to those support schemes. And with that, before we move on to recommendations, over to you, Jörg.
Yeah, just one or two sentences. One is, of course, the barriers vary across the continent, China. We have members telling us that in some localities, actually, the government goes the extra mile to help us, which is, of course, very important. So there's a difference in central receptiveness as well as local. And again, then the companies have to make that choice. Are they going for the local love theme, so to speak, or are they going to stay where the big operations are? But have less of government support there. Now, given, again, COVID and given the lockdown conditions, maybe some cities become more humble and actually roll out the red carpet more than before. Yeah, it's. I think we go straight for the recommendations, but I would just want to add on something because Jacob is on the line. He was creating a picture called business class, economy class, and cargo hold. That he labeled, I think it was a year or two ago, that really brings into a picture of what the study is all about. It means those companies that are multinationals that are big enough, they are in the respective growth area, they have the demand. Of course, they get pampered because they help China to close the gap to international knowledge. Then you have the economy class, meaning those companies nice to have, but you really might not need them, but they're helpful in certain segments. And then, of course, the cargo hold, as you can imagine from the picture, you can actually get rid of them at the next airport. Actually, they are always threatened in order, shall we stay or shall we go? In particular, again, the response rate shows it in ICT. ICT is definitely something where we see European companies either low-key or on the exit trail. So we go to recommendations, but like the Chinese economy as such, it sounds like a truism, but it's right for many, but not for all. So
Still you, Jörg, if you want to start.
That's my part, yes. Well, companies, I think that's my forte. We have the recommendation, of course, that they have to do the risk and opportunity analysis. Everybody has to do that. Of course, that's practice across the world. But we have to clearly have the China component in the back of our head, the kind of Made in China 2025 agenda, which comes with huge money, huge demand for Chinese companies, the exclusion of foreigners many ways. So people have to be aware if something, there's a big noise level, certain segment, there might be some business in there for them. At the same time, there might be a massive competition coming their way. And then, of course, you have to see if you are willing to take the risk in order to base research. The R is then to be investigated because the challenges you might face of losing intellectual property here, the new data transfer law, the new cybersecurity law might actually lead you to say, maybe R I do elsewhere in an OECD country. But on D, there's absolutely no discussion. D has to be done here. It's close to the customer. It's growing with your customer. And it means that you are actually learning from your customers on the latest trend lines. Again, the kind of lack of loyalty in branding actually makes companies very choosy and change topics very fast and layouts and everything else. Again, for us, my experience is that the Chinese R&D market is a fitness center. And if you're not up to it, you better quit at an early stage before you get a heart attack. Then, of course, generations ahead of local firms, yes, so far, but we have to localize it. And again, it is really, I think, underestimated how much Chinese customers are driving us. It's not that we come here and bless the market with new technologies and do R&D here. It is, again, something where also we learn and we take things back home to our headquarters. And then do your homework, filing patents, have a good lawyer. And if you don't have a good lawyer, find a way to the European Chamber, because we have an IPR help desk since about 12 years running online as well as offline. And then if you're still not happy, you can go across the bridge here in Beijing and go to the SME Center, which then can help you to find your way. But this, of course, targeting more towards SMEs. It is less the multinationals that have already a strong, deep engagement in this market. So I end with just saying that, again, everything here, to me at least, being in business myself, it's customer. It's the demand story. The demand, the happy customer pays, and you have the money for R&D. And again, for me, it is a small R in China, and it's a fat, big D. Nico.
Thanks, and just to wrap up, I think the fascinating story here is that this is really the front line of Europe-China relations, deepening R&D footprint, deepening an innovation partnership with a country that is on a very challenging domestic political trajectory, and at the same time is heading headwinds and seeing headwinds across the world, including from the European Union, in terms of the partnership that we're actually trying to shape. So you have companies going deeper with regard to their footprint, and you have politics moving into a different direction. And that challenge clearly is something that policymakers need to take into account. So European corporates see a promising future in China in general, but obviously also specifically with regard to their R&D activities in China. We have a risk picture here: tech leakage, theft. There's a general concern about EU firms empowering Beijing technologically, and that's a tension that we have to navigate with. So despite maybe the wishes in some European capitals that technology partnerships with China need to be scaled down, the contrary seems to be the case at the moment. And certainly we have to deal with the real risks, but they should be weighed against the benefits from European companies also building scale in the China market, as well as from the extraction of technologies from local collaboration partners that, at least in theory, if not any data restrictions, etc., restrict them, that empower their global competitiveness. So what we need is a pretty cold, dispassionate appraisal of the risks and rewards of such involvement in China's innovation ecosystem. And I think we're just at the beginning of such an assessment. At the end of the day, there will be political decisions required from the European Commission in those arenas where we do industrial policy, where technology restrictions are actually put in place. And obviously that's a topic that will also hit and be interfering with R&D activities in China. So we'll be looking at guidance also from member states and the Commission on those issues as we move forward. But at this point, I think we have to live with a very mixed picture, lots of opportunities seen on the corporate side, more challenges probably seen on the policy side of things. And that's something that we'll have to navigate jointly here between Berlin, Brussels, and Beijing. Back to you.
Well, the story, the study ends here, but I just didn't want to lose this opportunity to actually add on something which we normally always add on in other papers. That's recommendations to the Chinese government. One, of course, is a mantra from the European Chamber. It's like, keep more opening up. Shrink the negative list, encourage more foreign direct investment to come over here. And I think it's more needed than ever because the Chinese economy is in trouble, will be in trouble this year. So I think that already by now we have realized the sort of embracing of foreign business by top leaders that has to translate, of course, into real policy. But I think it's important that China realizes if it insists on self-reliance, if it goes too strong into a closed-up dual circulation system, then actually they will cut themselves off from top-end technologies and will technology-wise punch below their weight. The second is, of course, level playing field. And it's not just SOEs and foreign direct investment for us. It is also, again, Chinese SMEs. Chinese SMEs are now under huge stress because of the COVID lockdown situation. Many of them just have about 2 to 3 months of cash flow. And there, of course, the usual happens in times of crisis. The SOEs don't pay. The SOEs don't pay their suppliers. They don't pay primarily these SMEs. And those people actually are all of a sudden cash strapped in order to research and development. Again, they are standing for 90% of exports. They have the desire in order to come up with new products, new systems and so forth. And the way that they are being deprived of cash actually throws them back. Third topic is, of course, the usual strengthening of the intellectual property rights, a stronger system, better educated judges, better implementation of that. China is on a good path, has been for quite a while, but still I think it lacks a couple of areas also again for Chinese private enterprises. And then attract more foreign talents. It's all about diversity. It's very telling that the most innovative city in China is Shenzhen, where 60% of the population comes from outside Guangdong. So it's a Chinese diversity story. And foreigners are leaving China by the droves. We possibly see 50% of us leaving by summer. And then, of course, that takes away a lot of brain power and connection in order to actually do research and development here. Besides the point I made earlier, that very few Chinese students are in high-tech areas willing to come over here, a country where you might still end up in lockdown and the economy might be less alluring than it was maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So open up. Foreign talents are key to work in China, but at this stage it's really hard for us to find good people for our research and development activities in this country. So I end here, and I think Miko, Jacob, myself, we are very happy to take your questions.
All right. So we already have a number of questions in the Q&A function. So let me start. First question is, given the warnings that the Chamber has given about companies decoupling their China operations from global operations, are your members still making R&D investments based on global interconnectivity, or are they starting to adjust strategies to create dual R&D, one for China and one for the rest of the world?
I think when it comes to research, there's indeed a kind of a decoupling happening already. Again, that was not triggered by COVID, it was triggered by regulatory environment of China, the data transfer law, cybersecurity law, the kind of export ban that you might face if you have a patent developed over here. So much uncertainty that you really possibly then say, okay, if I can't do research in China, then I get the researchers to my headquarters, the Chinese researchers. But definitely development is going to remain the main driver, the kind of being close to customers, developing systems together, trying to draw on this in order to then not only to have a Chinese product with Chinese characteristics, but also inspire our headquarters in order to have products which might be selling better globally. I give you just one example, is the car industry. The average age of a person buying a car in Germany, Mercedes-Benz, is 53 years. And the average age of a Mercedes-Benz buyer in China is 35. And the ratio is very different of male, mostly male in Germany, and a huge part of their buyers, particularly the S-Class, believe it or not, is women. So in a way, Chinese are not just happy about what they see and what they assume is going to last for 10, 20 years as a car. They want gadgets. They want a computer on wheels. And hence, there's a huge drive in order for European companies in order to cater for that very different idea about how a car has to be put together. And we can see already now that some Europeans struggle with finding the right taste for Chinese, who again are not very brand loyal and go for the next gadget. If it's better, then I change the company that I was sourcing from before. So in a way, decoupling in this respect, I think is not on the cards on development. On research, I would really see there is a strong tendency of decoupling.
Thank you, Jörg.
Just to add to that, some of what, sorry, the sun has just opened up. So a lot of the interviewees that we spoke with, they indicated that, you know, this aspect of decoupling kind of China operations from global operations is more of a kind of medium to long-term concern. It's something they look at over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Whereas supply chain onshoring, that's much more of an immediate kind of tangible thing that they need to reconcile. But from what we heard from the interviewees, plus a lot of our own kind of assessment, is that the more that we see sort of decoupling in different layers of decoupling, the more that we see divergence between GDPR norms and China's data governance regime, and especially with its kind of vague rules and stuff within it, the more we see export controls on the Chinese side, but also the American side, and potentially on the European side, the more export controls that start to come into existence, but also perhaps start to actually come out of the toolbox and be utilized, that will drive that kind of forced localization of R&D. And importantly, so too is that kind of growing sentiment and sort of uncertainty and distrust in home markets about how much R&D is being done in China. So these are some of the factors that came up during the interviews and from the surveys, that each of those little components is kind of pushing this this issue forward year after year. So again, as we saw from the data, companies are universally have universally integrated their China R&D and their global R&D, but there is an anticipation that that may not be possible in the long run.
All right, thank you.
Do you want us to take a few from the questions that are in the chat or in the Q&A, or you want to hand them over directly to us?
Feel free to address them if you prefer.
Perfect.
So we have several.
Just briefly, I mean, Wolfgang Rudischhauser asking questions about unwilling transfer of R&D results to state-owned and military industries. Clearly, this is a concern, and that is a political concern that I think will become much more significant as we move forward. It is exactly that tension, I think, that we've referred to between the politics and the business side of things. Business on their own, and Jörg will know more about it in detail, have their own systems in place to mitigate those risks as much as possible based on their own data protection schemes on a company level, etc. But clearly, there is that concern, and it will prevent some of those R&D activities in the future. That's quite clear. The second point maybe that I want to take up here is by Ruth Kirchner on the dependency debate, and I know Jörg's response to that. So in light of the survey, can we actually afford to reduce engagement with China? And I think the response needs to be that this is not about necessarily a reduction, but about a recalibration of our engagement with China. And in many cases, companies will feel pressured to actually deepen their footprint, including on R&D activities. But we will have to be more careful and sometimes selective about the exact types of R&D activities, the sectors, the technologies, because as you pointed out in previous comments, the industries that are being decoupled are multiplying, plus the data security and cybersecurity stories are becoming a bit more worrying in many regards. So I think it's not about reducing, but probably about looking at a recalibration of our engagement in China. Back to you, Jörg.
Well, Wolfgang, I think we're all learning concerning our compliance in the Chinese marketplace. I think that some of us have had a rude awakening, in particular on US sanctions and not being mindful enough about implementing them right away in your sales in China. Keep on selling while it's on the list in DC. And of course, for some of our companies, very hard to see is it civilian, is there military, is there dual usage, and so forth and so forth. But I guess the awareness of actually checking it, looking for outside experts in order to help to determine who is the end consumer has never been higher than now. I can still imagine that mistakes happen, but overall, I think our companies are far more savvy in navigating that. To Ruth's question on the reduction of engagement, well, Russia is not China. Russia is a three product economy. China is selling 1.3 billion euro a day into the European Union and is in many cases a major employer and major inspiration on R&D. So whatever we do, and put it this way, whatever we don't do with China, we're cutting ourselves off. So we have to do the right thing. We have to basically look into our supply chains. The Xinjiang comes to mind, of course. We have to see there's no forced labor. If we can't prove it, we have to leave. That's obvious. But when it comes to just disengaging with China for the possibility that maybe something happens that happened to Russia is not in the cards. We are only disengaging if we see that the market is taking a south turn. We are only disengaging with China if we see we have a good other place where we can produce and likewise innovate. And we are only leaving China if actually operationally it's very difficult to actually do stuff here. Travel restrictions, for example, continuous lockdown, and so on and so on. But for the political side, I would say we are aware of what's going on, but we also are responsible towards our shareholders. So when it comes to the kind of disengagement on China, for example, we just 10 days ago launched a paper on carbon neutrality. Our companies are absolutely stellar and top-notch in that region. And China actually needs us and in many ways wants us. That's the business class that Jacob always talks about. And it's needed because China stands for 25% of global emissions. China burns 50% of global coal. So if we would withdraw from China, particularly in new technologies, if we would stop doing R&D in climate change related technologies, we would actually delay the fight against climate change tremendously. If some country has to do something on climate change, it's China, and hence we are doomed in order to stay here and do whatever we can in order to make that not only business, but also a task to safeguard our planet, frankly.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Before moving forward, I would like to remind everybody, and particularly media representatives, to clearly state their affiliation when they type their questions in the chat. Also, to the media representatives present in the room, please let us know if you have any questions as well. All right.
Maybe I can take on the question from Andy Walti. Sounds Swiss to me. Why was the pharma industry not part of the survey? And yes, sure enough, he's with a Swiss company. Well, first of all, they were not really represented in research development working groups. Secondly, we had, again, the observation that when it comes to pharmaceuticals, China's dealing more with generics. Companies find it very difficult to come up with new products here. And I think the way that biotech has been dealt with is not very enticing for foreign companies in order to come here. Again, the best technology in the market for fighting mutation, a virus that has not been accepted here for simple nationalistic reasons might give you some thought, food for thought. dealing with this thing. Again, we have a strong China in engineering. We have a surprisingly weak China when it comes to the ranking of universities in life sciences, be it biological science, human biological science, veterinary agriculture. And medical is even more dismal. China is anywhere close to the top of clinical medicine and dentistry and pharmaceutical sciences. As a matter of fact, from 100 universities globally, just 5 Chinese stick out as good enough in order to do that kind of thing. And that contrasts again with material science. China stands for 40 out of 100. So I guess that's also one of the reasons, not just generic, the demand and the kind of regulatory environment, which makes it difficult. I can imagine that also the brain pool is just so much more denser and more open or more engaging in the US or in the UK, for example, or in Switzerland, of course.
Maybe just briefly on 2 questions, again, in the Q&A, whether there's a comparative angle to the study that we did. No, unfortunately not, but it's China focused, but the point is absolutely well taken. I think that this is about comparative attractiveness of innovation ecosystems indeed. So would require deeper research, which we didn't do in this study. This is anecdotal, and Jörg certainly has a broader picture there, how many multinationals from the EU are considering localization, at least headquarter conversations that we are having across Europe on those issues. This is front and center. So the degree of localization, the modalities of localization in light of the global decoupling trends, but also in light of the lure of the Chinese market and R&D ecosystem are absolutely central. So I can't give you a hard percentage figure here, but I would guess that for a majority of European MNCs, that's probably a key topic that they're looking at the moment. Back to you, Jörg.
Well, how many multinationals has considered localization? We don't have to consider it anymore because we're doing it. We have, I would say on staffing, around about 99% of our staffing is Chinese nationals. In many companies, by the way, 100%. So in a way, there's no catch up to do there. Of course, we establish companies left and right and center. I don't have the European data set, but I know that German companies alone employ around about 1 million people in China. And of course, the localization would have been far more interesting if we could actually do M&As in China as Chinese companies can do M&As in Europe. It's very difficult if you have a famous brand or if you're in a protected area, again, negative list, for European companies to buy into Chinese companies. A majority of European business in China is greenfield, meaning building factories from the ground, adding new jobs. And until recently, the majority of M&As and business in Europe was Chinese buying into existing European companies, maintaining jobs, but not necessarily creating more jobs. Luckily, this has changed, and it's very nice to see that top-notch companies like CATL are establishing greenfields in East Germany on batteries. So there's a new tendency. Chinese companies increasingly feel more secure in order to engage on that sort in the European marketplace. Huawei has always been a front runner in doing a lot of research in Germany or in France and Belgium and other places. So there are tendencies. It takes a while, but of course now everything is put on hold because of the travel restrictions. Travel restrictions hurt us in putting getting the best people into China, but the same is applicable to Chinese talents and Chinese managers and M&A specialists not being able to fly to Europe to look for takeover targets and engage there for the simple reason is that it's very tedious, no visa, or you have quarantine when you come back. So in a way, this zero tolerance policy, the kind of lacking of China to be on the global scene like virtually the rest of the world, actually is causing headwinds for China's innovation drive. One more?
Yeah, just to jump in on a couple of these questions, including some from Wolfgang and Lucy that we've already touched upon. The level of localization of R&D operations, but also the decision to transfer technology to your China operations and therefore, create risk of technological leakage or forced tech transfer, technology theft, things like this. I won't go into too much detail because you can find it in the report itself, but we did outline quite a few of the different strategies that different European companies have sort of embraced to kind of maximize their opportunities and minimize those technology risks. But the two main categories that we come into is that there's sort of an all-in group and there's a hedged bets group. The all-in ones, this tends to be in technologies where Chinese competitors have largely closed the technology gap. And so you have to bring your latest, most cutting edge technology, and you need to refine it within the China market and also develop new products to keep up with your Chinese competition. And therefore, you're going to transfer more technology. You're going to locate more of your R&D resources in China. And therefore, that localization becomes a lot more intense. Whereas in the hedged bet side of things, we see quite a few companies that they tend to be, a step or two, or maybe a generation or two of technology ahead of their Chinese competitors. And so they decide to bring kind of lower tier technology, maybe one generation, two generations back, and localize the production and the R&D of that kind of line of business, while they keep sort of their crown jewels back in their home market, where they're safer from technology transfer requirements or from tech leakage. Again, there are a whole bunch of nuances to those two strategies and a couple of other strategies in the report that I think are well worth looking into, but it largely depends on where a company's technological prowess and position in the overall market is compared to their Chinese competitors. So I would encourage everyone to give it a read to touch upon those strategies.
Maybe I just refer to Wolfgang's questions on innovation made in China, or is China further developing the innovation made in the US, for example. Let me first say that China has been catching up on big spending when it comes to R&D. China spends on average, I think last year it was 2.4% of GDP on research and development. OECD countries on average 2.5, so pretty much in the same league. And China accounts for 1/5 of global research and development by now. So there's a lot of financial firepower that is going into that area. And that produces a lot of patents, for example. China has been topping the global rankings for patent filing since 2019, way above what you have in Germany and Korea, for example, having surpassed the US and Japan 5 or 3 years ago, respectively. But again, also the quality of applications still lags behind development economies. That's a big challenge that they're facing. Lots of patents, but for example, among the most 100 vital important patents last year, there was not a single Chinese patent. And China is a super producer in scientific publications. They account for 20.7% of global output of research papers. So it's a lot of things ending up there. But again, the question is it going to be basic research? Is it going to be applications? What are the patents standing for? And that's, at least at this stage, clear-cut bias towards engineering. Again, the fact I was raising before, if you have half of global universities in engineering are going to be top-notch, number one is Chinese, then of course in the areas where they're dominating, be it biomedical engineering, be it nanoscience and nanotechnologies, be it energy science and engineering, is China mostly between 35 and 50% of occupying the top positions in the respective 100 top universities. And that all has to do with that China actually produces a lot of bridges and planes and aerospace and other areas. Engineering is just so dominant, and it's so dominant that it actually gets you the money in order to do basic research also in that area. Again, China's falling way behind in natural sciences, life sciences, medical sciences, where basically they will still rely to a large extent on Europe and the US. I think in most of these areas, US and Europe stand for 90% of all the top 100 universities. But again, on engineering, it's genuine, it's real, and it's really incredibly impressive.
Yeah, I'll jump in and take Shuixin's question from Novozymes. So does China's self-reliance strategy on technology already impact on MNC's R&D plans or even business in China? And how should we mitigate this trend? Yeah, again, it really depends on your positioning within sort of how Beijing views sort of strategic technologies versus non-strategic technologies. So as Jörg mentioned, we have this business class, economy class, and cargo hold spectrum. And in the economy class, kind of in the middle, that's the vast majority of companies, that they're kind of in non-sensitive technologies, especially if they're more consumer and oriented. And that Beijing is kind of ambivalent as to whether it's a Chinese company that's private or a Chinese state-owned company or a foreign private company. But the strategic industries where Beijing is most interested in kind of closing the technology gap, that's actually where you then get into the business class and into the cargo hold. And what defines whether you're in the business class or the cargo hold within those strategic technologies is how far ahead you are from Chinese competitors. So again, when you look at the chemicals, the industrial machinery, industrial software and such that are in the business class, they are several generations of technology ahead of Chinese companies. And so Beijing will roll out the red carpet for them. And this applies to the R&D aspect as well. And this is why we see so many respondents to this survey that were so optimistic that are found in that business class. China can't close the technology gap. It needs that localization. So it opens up and rolls out the red carpet. And then in the cargo hold, you have your companies where Chinese companies have closed that technology gap or are close to doing so. And again, reflecting on like the ICT and telecoms industries and the technologies related to that, you have companies like Huawei and ZTE that have very much closed that gap. And as a result, the kind of self-reliance, the technological self-reliance campaign has a really negative impact, because now foreign companies that are competitors to those Chinese companies that have closed the technology gap are very much viewed as unnecessary market competition. And that there's a desire to sort of push them out and ensure that the Chinese national champions in that sector can sort of have exclusive market share within the China market, and then exert that economy of scale when they compete abroad. This is the story we saw with high-speed rail about a decade and a half ago. This is now a story that we're seeing with ICT and telecoms. So how to mitigate the impacts of this self-reliance campaign is to keep yourself as much as possible in the business class, which means you have to stay ahead of your Chinese competitors. And again, check out the reports that, you know, in some cases, the best way to stay ahead might be an all-in approach. It might be a hedge bets approach about what kind of technology you localize for your R&D and for innovation in China. But again, the difference between the business class and cargo hold is entirely based on how far ahead or how close a foreign company is to Chinese champions. So maintaining that distance is essential for keeping that red carpet rather than getting kicked out of the back of the plane.
Let me go to the question on the reference points on other Asian markets. It's not in the study. It would have basically made the study too big in order to have reference points there. We would have had to make a survey among companies operating there. But of course, what Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia are lacking is the demand story. Again, coming back to this kind of who is going to fund your research and development. Are you able to actually get the money in order to do stuff there? Neither of these three regions have the kind of financial demand story in order for companies to go there. But at the same time, when it comes in particular to research, less to development, there's a very strong bias towards the OECD countries or also Southeast Asia, because we want to tap into the kind of trust system that is established between government, companies, and universities, in particular in Japan and Korea. And that actually helps us to develop new products that are going to determine our company's fate for decades to come. Again, research, basic research. And again, China is momentarily putting itself in a corner because of the zero tolerance policy. and CEOs and politicians are flying back and forth. German Chancellor Scholz was first of all in Japan, and sure enough, R&D was on the agenda, and sure enough, there were some business captains coming with him. We have the German President Steinmeier flying to Singapore and Jakarta this month. And sure enough, the plane is going to be full again with people. So the world is not waiting for China to sort itself out. And there is a lot of engagement, in particular with the Japanese and Korean industries in the areas of car technologies, hydrogen, as well as semiconductors. And again, there might be a shift for doing the real thing that is really groundbreaking outside China, and doing the development, the solution finding with customers within China. I think that would not be to the advantage for the Chinese innovation ecosystem, but given the travel constraints, and which seem to be unending, I think there's a tendency, it still can be reversed, but China is running the risk of punching below its weight when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, Jeroen, yeah, I saw your hand raised. Just FYI for everyone in the room, Jeroen is a colleague here at MERICS, the head of program for the Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy team. He was also very much involved in the interviews and the survey and analysis and writing of the report. Over to you, Jeroen.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, just maybe a few comments on a number of these questions. I think one of the issues that has been raised a few times is really how, I guess, to what extent Chinese policy is shaping EU business R&D activities in China. And of course, the survey tries to shed a light on that. And, you know, we've tried to unpack some of those things already in discussion here. But my kind of take is that to quite a large degree, the impact is really very visible. The concept of these kind of red carpets and this middle branch and the cargo hold distinction between where you sit as a company, I think really makes that very clear that if you're on the sort of good side, then there are more opportunities, and companies are really quite active in certain ways and benefiting from that. We can see from the survey that, for instance, direct benefits from subsidies are not a major factor in their decisions, but there are lots of still lots of support that they do benefit from. HNTE status has been named. And then I think I want to mention, I guess for the indirect support goes through the innovation ecology with development of talent and IPR regimes. And I think aside sort of an interesting component of that is also the larger innovation ecology that I think we'll see the companies that are in the kind of red carpet zone, treatment zone are going to benefit more from, and will seek to engage more with. And that includes engaging still, I think, with zones and applying for research grants, although we see that's not happening yet at the moment. We can unpack why that's the case. I think the report sheds some light on that in details as well. So I think that in the end, kind of trying to bring that together, I think then a key question moving forward will be whether European companies can also export more of the innovation that they do in China to their global operations. And we have the digital policy, digital regulation in China that are a major factor there. But maybe just to highlight something from the report, the digital twin example that was already mentioned earlier, that's exactly something that can be done really well in China. Is a really prime example of sort of Chinese software with European hardware to some extent. This is a type of R&D that China is really good at as well. But unfortunately, this is also something that has been difficult to then be exported and be implemented at a global scale for European companies. So I think as China is getting closer to the global cutting edge, there will be more and more emphasis not on localizing European products to the Chinese market, but also in generating innovations that can contribute to global innovation and products. And then in that case, I think an open question and maybe to some extent a recommendation to the Chinese government is that in order to keep doing that and convince European corporations to do that kind of work in China, it's important for these innovations to become more part of global development, and that kind of this China to global, the C2G pipeline is not in any way. So
maybe I just go for Ms. Zhao Chen's question on does China intend to be independent from the US? Clearly, they're trying to be as independent as possible because they are aware of the kind of dependency they have. But it's a very, very long way to go. We actually covered that in 2 studies last year. In January, we launched decoupling story with MERICS together. And in December, we came up with a standards study also referring to the fact that China wants to be a global player on setting the standards, which then, of course, leads to the kind of new technologies that you bring to the marketplace. So clearly, but will we be asked to replace the US? I'm sure we will not be asked, because if China wants to replace US product technologies, they want to replace it with domestic indigenous technologies and not to make themselves dependent on another, from their point of view, unreliable partner maybe. And so I guess that the thing that we have to watch out is how much is China really willing to engage us in crucial technologies. Again, we see already the lack of reply from our members on the ICT side to the R&D study, indicating already that that ship has already sailed. And we have to watch out what kind of areas China will label as strategic or give a security angle. Then, of course, for us, it's going to be equally difficult. So I don't see us replacing or basically stepping in for our US compadres.
Yeah, just to step in to answer Du Yongjia's question, that 0% sufficient government support seems unbelievable. Did companies try to apply for that? So the simple answer is yes. Many of the companies we interviewed had at least attempted and applied for some level of government support. What really matters is what kind of support is available, and also what kind of like how much support was included in that. So by far the most important type of government support that's available is the HNTE status, because that results in a 10 percentage point drop in corporate taxes, which is massive. But more commonly, though, when we spoke with a lot of these companies, they indicated that the kind of research grants that are available and the kind of small subsidies here and there that exist, you know, they were interesting in certain cases, but overall, the big multinationals that made up the bulk of the interviews and interviewees and surveys or survey respondents, they have incredibly well-funded R&D operations. They have significant budgets, and so when you're looking at the kind of pretty small numbers that are involved in a lot of the kind of smaller and especially kind of more provincial and local government subsidies and state aid and backing for R&D, this is quite limited. And so again, I would echo that it's not so much that 0% have been able to access government support, it's that they viewed it as insufficient. Importantly, though, the SME that we spoke to, they had a very different view about these kinds of grants, but also about access to high-tech and innovation kind of special zones. And again, we heard this as well from some of the MNCs with regard to their SME suppliers, that because you're talking about smaller companies with smaller R&D budgets, the kind of money that is available in these sorts of government grants and state support for R&D is quite significant. And similarly, the kind of advantages that they get by locating some of their operations or locating entirely in some of these special zones does make a huge difference. So again, it kind of varies from company to company, but when you're talking about, as Jörg has mentioned several times now, these super optimistic, big European auto companies, chemical companies, and industrial machinery companies that are making, considerable profits in the China market, they're going to have more than enough money to kind of fund their own R&D. So whatever exists out there from the government tends to be pretty small by comparison.
We have Matthias Kamp here from the Swiss daily Neue Zürcher Zeitung. So Matthias.
Yeah, thank you, Jörg. I'm still trying to make sense what impact the recent Omicron wave has on all this. Of course, the survey was done before, but when I listened to all these flash surveys that we had from the European Chamber, from AmCham, from British Cham, from German Cham, from Swiss Cham, where there was always like percentages of like 25, 26, sometimes 30% of companies considering to relocate certain activities out of China. We will have to live probably with this situation as it is now with lockdowns for the next 1 or 2 years, I think. Travel restrictions, you always mention expat exodus. This must have an impact on what you presented to us just now.
Yes.
In what way, or is it too early to say?
No, it has an impact already now. That is very hard. I think we have passed the recruitment season for the next year to replace talents in our R&D labs. Again, we have a hard time getting Chinese engineers and talents into our headquarters and our headquarter labs, as well as that our people cannot come here for a visit. And then R&D is not just about online. You actually have to be there physically. So that has been impaired already. Again, we have collaborations with customers, with universities and other places. Demanding. And again, if these companies, because of the economic downturn, actually take a financial hit, then there will be less possible money and engagement with those people doing new stuff, new products, for example. The economic downturn has quite a robust negative impact, in particular of those companies that are SMEs, as I outlined before. And SMEs are the drivers of innovation in China. It's not necessarily SOEs that are the ones that come up with new products. They have easy time to get the money. And again, they're withholding cash from those SMEs. So we might have to really see who's going to survive this kind of downturn, in particular in the Yangtze Delta, which has been absolutely crucial for our European companies as partners in research and development. And again, the biggest point for all of us is the uncertainty. When is China going to get out of this? There's no communication. I think they can't communicate because they don't know themselves of when it's going to be, again, easy to travel without going through all these hoops and loops of testing and whatnot. I suspect that it goes way into 2023. And to your questions, are you considering to move to another country? 23% of our members said yes. But it's like asking, are you considering to divorce your husband? And you might say, maybe not, but I'm considering it, But maybe in 1 year, we are not considering it anymore. Then it's sort of, clear that this marriage is not going to last, and this relationship with China is not going to develop as we hope for. But at this stage, European companies stay put, and you can see it in the unwillingness to lay off people, saying that I don't lay off people. I have trained them, I have developed them. Again, if we do a survey at the end of the year, I think looking at are you willing to lay off people is going to be the crucial question. Then you can see that things might actually be loosening up over here. But in the meantime, again, companies are not sleeping. We are not leaving, we're maybe considering leaving, some of us, but the new projects, the new developments, the new business engagements are taking place primarily outside China. And that might then kickstart demand for research and development, new products, high-end in Japan, Korea, or the economy of Taiwan. And then, of course, the others are more cost-sensitive areas. It's going to be Vietnam and Southeast Asia and so forth. And Singapore is first and foremost, for example, biotechnology. you know. They don't have this regulatory straitjacket that China has on data transfer. Hence, they get the biotechnology part. So again, for me, China's R&D capability is extremely lopsided on the engineering part and very underdeveloped in the other parts I mentioned before. And they could have developed more if they would open the door for European business. Hence, again, my biggest worry is that China's punching below its weight. China has everything going its way, and it might be actually putting the damper on the innovation ecosystem just themselves. So,
Does anybody want to address? Oh, sorry, we have one question as well here.
Thank you. I am Anshuman Mishra from India's public broadcaster here in China. So my question is very basic in the sense that the terms and conditions or the facilitations which China was giving to the companies for setting up their R&D facilities here, or maybe their other operational facilities here. So are they undergoing severe changes in last 2-3 years, maybe due to the COVID or due to Chinese government's policies, broader, crackdowns or other things? So do you see severe changes in those conditions? Thank you.
well, as one of our viewers has already noticed, 0% of us sort of draw on government funds in order to do R&D. That indeed was frankly also a shocker for me. But at the same time, possibly it has to do that the majority was multinational, and the majority of multinationals wants to have R&D where the customers are, and the R&D of basically where their headquarters is, where their sales is. They want to have it integrated so that they don't lose on information from marketing to production, R&D coming up. And again, that also indicates the strong focus on development, less research. Research maybe you can do somewhere in the woods by yourself, but at the same time, if you are focusing on development, you really want to get the messages from marketing of what the customer wants. And then you really have to be close to production in order to make sure that they don't produce something totally different. And the development, you have to be close to the customer. Mostly areas, customers are Yangtze Delta and the Pearl Delta River and so forth. So in a way that these areas don't need to actually throw money at multinationals is obvious, because we're coming there in the first place voluntarily. We don't come because of the government's blue eyes. We come because of Great Wall, because of SAIC, because of Cherry, Chile, whatnot. They are throwing money at us in order to get them onto world-class status. So for SMEs, it's a different matter, I guess. For them, it's really luring them. If they get a major funding going, then maybe they also agree to a third or second tier city, I would say. And again, if you are qualified for this high-end national technology status, that gives you, instead of 25% tax, only 15, I think. So it's a lower tax grade. That applies to everyone. So that actually is not something where the government gives it to you. It's actually something where you can save it from the government by submitting the right papers. And I think majority of our companies do that. So they don't take actively funds, but they're trying to save on taxes and emphasize the research development area, which is tedious. It's a lot of paperwork. It's not easy. You have to reapply again and again. You have to prove what you're doing. But that, again, our companies are pretty much very far away from government funds in order to do basic research primarily. And it has also something to do with what I think all of us globally have in mind is, as they say in English, what God gives, God taketh. If the government gives you tax breaks, they might take it away if the going gets tough. And every indication is the going gets tough, particularly for local governments right now. So again, our companies look where the market is and where the customers are, and not where the government is. Yep. Rapid.
Hi, a question from Reuters, and that is, you talked just now about how European companies are not looking to lay off people at the moment. This is kind of prime hiring season now, at least for graduates. How's how do hiring rates compare this year amongst European companies in China with previous years?
Well, I think the trend line is interesting. It used to be that foreign companies used to be really number one in the wish list of many graduates. That has changed to government positions and state-owned enterprises. I guess the kind of security of the job matters a lot. If you're working for a Chinese private enterprise or a foreign company, if the economy takes a hit, you might actually be out. You know, the typical last in, first out. Again, also what many European companies are working on is areas where we really need expertise, knowledge, and experience. Meaning that when they come from graduate school, you might actually have to train them up 2 or 3 years in order to get them in a position to establish themselves in an operation. You know, that's also one of the downsides of the Chinese educational system. Is it's extremely top heavy. The strength of particular Central Europe is that it has a very sophisticated education system in order for those in the interface of blue collar and white collar. I forget the English word for it, the dual system that we have. That is something which I think is lacking, and it's very important because these guys that are possibly wearing a blue coat are driving major machinery on a very highly sophisticated IT basis, you know, but they're still having the blue suit on, and they are not sitting in a nice office. And there's a great reluctance among graduates that have been studying for so many years not to go home to their parents and say, by the way, I'm going to work in a factory, you know, and you see me from Monday to Friday in blue outfit. There is not this kind of pride that we have, particularly in Europe, of these people actually running major machineries, having spent a lot of time in education and training sessions, and just be fine and earning a lot of money as specialists, you know. And the other one that worries me, of course, for the future cooperation with China on research and development is, frankly, the kind of erosion of putting an emphasis on learning English. Meaning that I think in primary school, it's not even taking place anymore. There has been a new policy that in primary school, where kids absorb languages just like nothing, English is not being taught or emphasized anymore. Then they kind of cracked down on tutoring last year, which definitely has an impact on language abilities and other abilities of people. And then, of course, the kind of emphasis on Chinese and not on English language, that will also already harm the kind of global outlook and the global engagement level of Chinese young people. And then, of course, to top it all off right now, since about August last year, they hardly issue new passports, let alone now you have to have an exit interview if you want to leave the country. So everything is sort of indicating it's like, nah, not really. I don't want to have a global profile. I don't want to sort of engage there. I don't want to sort of have the abilities in order to communicate with lots of people around the world, be it India, be it Europe, be it South America, in English, in order to have a common language. And that's eroding, and is definitely not helpful for the innovation ecosystem of China. So we have...
Okay, we have a couple of questions. Maybe one, we answered the one from Sissy from Nikkei Asia. Are some expats leaving Shanghai or China following the Shanghai lockdown? Do you think that the Shanghai lockdown will impact the innovation in the city for the long run?
Well, Sissy, we can't count them because they left already. There's a lot of people that are willing to leave now, even premature, ahead of their contract term. The German chamber, I think, had this question, AmCham had this question, and the estimation was about 50% leaving this summer. Now, you have to also keep in mind that our numbers are already incredibly small. I made this example saying all the Europeans, meaning including the Brits, European Union in China are 60,000, meaning we all fit into a soccer stadium. That indicates already if 50% are leaving, then there's hardly anybody left of essence. So in a way, The number of expats has been eroding, and also so has the kind of emotional attachment of people in Europe with China, the kind of positive feel that you develop here when you're working among your Chinese colleagues, the love for the culture and stuff. If you can't get a visa, if you can't get here, you can't develop this kind of empathy. And of course, that will show in a couple of years. It's rather unfortunate.
All right, so I think that time is up. We have some questions that have gone unanswered, but for media representatives, feel free to send us an email if you have anything else. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining this session, and have a good morning. And those in Europe have a good, the opposite, have a good afternoon in China. And for those in Europe, have a good morning.
Well, and let me add by thanking Miko and Jacob for doing this, and Jerome, but also say, the next product is coming your way in the cinemas on the 20th of June, that you have the business confidence survey, our customary big one, including many of the questions that you actually just raised. It will be launched on the 20th, and it will be launched by Bettina Schön, our Vice President and Chairwoman for Shanghai. So stay tuned. Thank you.